Bienvenidos a lección de gramática 16.3, el pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo. In English, this would be grammar lesson 16.3, the past subjunctive. Now, before I get too much into the past subjunctive, it's important for you to have a basic understanding of the subjunctive mood in general, and you'll need to understand when and how it's used. We went over this in Spanish 3 when you learned how to conjugate things in the present subjunctive, so let's do a quick review, make sure you understand the subjunctive mood, and then we'll talk about the past subjunctive conjugations. ¿Qué es el subjuntivo? ¿Cuándo lo usamos? What is the subjunctive, and when do we use it? Well, if you recall from Spanish 3, I taught you an acronym that you could use to help you remember the different uses of the subjunctive. The acronym spelled out the word weirdo, the W indicating that the subjunctive mood is used when you're wishing or willing something. The E reminded us that sometimes we use the subjunctive when we're talking about emotions or how something makes us feel. The I is used for impersonal expressions. R kind of ties into willing or wishing, but R is when you're recommending something. The D stands for doubt, denial, and even disbelief, which often lead to using the subjunctive mood. And the O helps us remember that key phrase, ojalá, meaning I wish that or hope that something would happen. Now, when you're using the subjunctive, it's important to understand there's typically two separate clauses that have some kind of a connector. In the example here, you see in the main clause, also sometimes called the independent clause, we have just a regular conjugation. That would be in the indicative. Remember, the indicative is anything that's not subjunctive. So this is just regular present tense. Es muy importante. It is very important. Then you have your connector, and then you have your subordinate clause, sometimes called the dependent clause. The subordinate clause or dependent clause cannot exist without the main clause or the independent clause. Okay, I don't know if I have you confused here, but the main thing you need to recognize is that when you're using the subjunctive, you're going to have these two separate clauses, and they will both have different subjects, and that's important for you to understand, because if I just wanted to say a sentence about myself and my own personal hopes and desires, for example, if I wanted to say, I hope to dance, I would just say, yo espero bailar, using the infinitive form for to dance. However, if I want to say, I hope that they dance, then it becomes, yo espero que ellos bailen, with the subjunctive conjugation for the verb bailar. Here's a couple more examples. These all use the impersonal expressions. But of course, as we've learned, there's a lot of other verbs that fit into that whole realm of the weirdo acronym. Now, when you were conjugating in the present subjunctive, the rule that we used was to drop the O from the yo form, and of course that would be the present tense indicative yo form, and add the opposite ending. So as a reminder, if the verb was an AR verb, your opposite endings would be es, hemos, es, and en. If it was an ER or an IR verb, your opposite endings would be as, amos, ais, and an. Okay, as you might predict, those would be your opposite endings. They kind of look like the opposite endings that we used when we were talking about commands, right? Well, if you remember, commands are a part of this subjunctive mood. So if you feel really comfortable and confident with how to form and use commands in your speaking and writing, then I think the subjunctive is probably a little bit easier for you, or a little easier to understand. Now, with regular pattern verbs, the examples here are very predictable, right? You simply take off the O from that yo form and you're adding the opposite ending, like we just said. Nothing weird going on there. Sometimes we had those irregular yo forms, and so it's important to remember if it's a go verb or a ZCO verb that you just still drop the O and add the opposite ending. So these were still somewhat predictable. Now we have the car, gar, zar verbs, and if you recall, when you do a spelling change, when you change the ending of a car, gar, zar verb, you also have a spelling change that occurs. For car verbs, the C changes to a QU before adding the E. For gar verbs, the G changes to a GU before adding the E. And for those zar verbs, the Z changes to a C before adding the E. And remember, the main reason that we do this is to help you out with pronunciation. If the yo form of sacar was spelled S-A-C-E, it wouldn't be pronounced sake, it would be pronounced sase. And so in order to keep the same sound that you have in the infinitive form of the verb, we make these spelling changes. The last weird thing that we had to learn about the present tense subjunctive was that stem changing verbs, of course, have their own special rule. AR and ER verbs were fairly predictable because they would go ahead and stem change in all forms except nosotros and vosotros. As you recall, I refer to the stem changing verbs oftentimes as boot verbs, and the nosotros and vosotros forms are outside of the boot. And so that same rule that you're used to still applied with this present subjunctive conjugations. IR verbs, however, were a little bit of a different story. The nosotros and vosotros forms still have a stem change, but it's not the stem change you're used to. In these, the stem change would be E to I or O to U, as in the examples below with pedir, sentir, and dormir. And then we had a couple of irregular verb forms that we also learned about with the present subjunctive. These should look familiar to you as they're the same 5 verbs that we talked about being irregular in the to negative, the usted and ustedes command forms. Okay, that was the subjunctive, present subjunctive in a nutshell. Now let's talk about the past subjunctive. Okay, now that we've reviewed the subjunctive mood in general and kind of reviewed how it's used in the present subjunctive, let's talk about past subjunctive. It is a little different, but a lot of the same rules still apply, and the usage is very similar to the present subjunctive. Like we did with the present subjunctive, this will still be used in multiple clause sentences, and it's still used with those same weirdo verbs and those same situations. Okay, now when you're going to conjugate in the past subjunctive, here's your rule. You're going to drop the on from the preterite third person plural form, that would be the ellos, ellas, ustedes form, and then you'll add the endings that you see in this chart. The good news is it doesn't matter if it's an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb, they're all going to use these same endings. A, as, a, amos, ais, and an. You'll notice there's no accent on the vosotros form this time. Go ahead and copy down those endings, and then we will continue. Here's a couple of examples of what that past subjunctive conjugation would look like. So for the verb hablar, your third person plural preterite form would be hablaron. So you're dropping the on and then adding those opposite endings that we just talked about. For the third person preterite plural form of beber, your verb would be bebieron. So we're dropping the on and adding the a endings now. Now, in your book and in the examples that you see on this slide, which are taken from your book, you'll notice that the book emphasizes the rule of dropping the ron off of the third person preterite plural form. But for me, it's easier to remember. Just drop the on, because if you take the r off, you're simply going to add the r back in. So you might as well just leave it on there. One thing to notice is that the nosotros form has an accent over the A or the E that is right before that ending. And as we've talked about, accents are usually there just to help you out with your pronunciation, and that's the case in these words as well. So this will help you make sure you put your emphasis on the correct syllable, especially as some of these words like escribiéramos, some of those words get really long, and so this will help you out a little bit with your pronunciation. Okay, and there's some more examples. And then we have some irregulars. These happen to be the same irregulars that you were used to using in your preterite tense. So really, if you know the third person plural preterite form, these aren't really irregular. They still follow the same rule. It's just that you have to remember those preterite stem changes that took place. Okay, we talked about how the past subjunctive is used basically in the same way as the present subjunctive, and here's a couple more examples. Me pidieron que no llegara tarde, so they asked me not to arrive late. Me sorprendió que ustedes no vinieran a la cena. It surprised me that you didn't come to the dinner. Salió antes de que yo pudiera hablar contigo. He left before I could talk to you. Ellos querían que yo escribiera una novela romántica. They wanted me to write a romantic novel. Now, if you look at these examples, you'll notice that pidieron, sorprendió, and salió are all the main clause is conjugated in the preterite tense. However, if you look at the fourth example, ellos querían, you'll notice that's not the preterite tense, that's the imperfect tense. But what's kind of cool about past subjunctive is it doesn't matter which of the two past tenses you use in your main clause. The past subjunctive conjugation is always going to be the same in the subordinate clause. So to continue a little bit on that, I talked about how the main clause, when we're talking about the subjunctive, could include the preterite or the imperfect. However, the main clause or the independent clause may also contain a conjugation in the conditional tense or the past perfect tense, as well as the present tense. Now, this gets a little bit tricky, but this could be an example, like if you're talking about a current opinion of past events. So you could say like, it's a bummer that they didn't come to the party. Es una lástima que ellos no, and then you would have your past subjunctive conjugation. So you would have vinieran a la fiesta. Now I know vinieran sounds a lot like vinieron, so you have to really enunciate with your pronunciation so that people know that you're using the subjunctive. But at the same time, if you make a little error, it's really not as noticeable. Okay, lastly, here are a few practice examples I would like you to try. If you have some space at the bottom of your notes page, just go ahead and jot down these past subjunctive conjugations. Practice them, bring them to class. We'll go over them and make sure you did them correctly. If you have any other questions, let me know.